I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. Rent control used to be a policy tool in expensive cities such as New York, but the national housing affordability crisis has pushed the problem out into the suburbs to where California in 2019 passed a statewide tenant protection law. In the Washington, D.C. region, the District of Columbia has weak rental protection that applies only to construction completed prior to 1976 and nothing else. Earlier this year, Prince George's County passed time-limited rent control. Montgomery County itself had an emergency rent law in place during the pandemic. The most robust rent control in the region belonged to the city of Tacoma Park, whose 1981 law also ensured that not one new apartment building has been built in the city for 4 decades. And yet, the tide turned. After the Maryland primary in July 2022, on the podcast, I provided a straw poll on the possibility of a new rent control law and concluded the long-time resistance to rent control in Montgomery County has fallen. A year later, not only does Montgomery County look set to have rent control, but it comes on the heels of 3 tax increases: property, recordation, and impact, all of which negatively impact developers and building owners and realtors, who are the perennial boogeymen in local politics. To get to the bottom of what happened, I talked to local housing advocate Mike English, who found himself in the middle of the debate over whether rent control law was entirely or manageably deleterious to housing supply, the other pathway toward housing affordability.
Oh, there's a good song on when I die, something with a melody that I can softly sigh, a minuet, a rhapsody, a sweet lullaby. I hope there's a good song on when I die. I hope there's a good song on when I pass through the gates of heaven with a big brass band, trumpets, horns, and tubas.
I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society moving precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. Music for this episode comes from the band Finster, which was first formed in State College, Pennsylvania in the 1990s. And they came back together after 25 years for their second album, Crosswinds, which they released on the podcast earlier in January this year. Kate Servino-Johnson on vocals and guitar, Doogie Whitaker on guitar and vocals, Howard Rayback on the bass, and Matt Zielenz on the drums.
When my friend the reaper in the evening comes to take me home, I'll walk beside him and sing all the songs I've got to know, that I have learned well on this earth, and he is sure to grin. My friend the reaper will harmonize while I sing. I hope there's a good song on when I go. Let's finish off this inning and head off.
Before we get to the news update this week, 2 corrections. First, in the episode on the Safe Streets Bill, I had said that as a society, we are walking less and less. This is incorrect. We are walking more and driving more in bigger and bigger vehicles, which is what has increased the conflict between automobiles and pedestrians, and consequently has also increased injuries, and deaths. The second error came in the description in the June 30th episode of the rent control bill headed to approval then and now passed. I had said that the bill was the Home Act. The implications of the error will become more evident in my discussion with Mike English, but the Home Act bill is the one that fell off, and the competing anti-rent gouging bill was amended to come into line with the Home Act and then passed. We take accuracy seriously and thank listeners who listen closely and let us know. In a second programming note, I Hate Politics is not a specialist podcast, but intended for folks who, on most days, hate politics. As a result, I am mindful of using jargon, and I want to highlight one for this episode, the term YIMBY, which stands for Yes in My Backyard. But this only makes sense if we know that YIMBY is a response to NIMBY, not in my backyard, a political and sociological position of entitlement and privilege where my environs are to be protected and kept beautiful no matter what happens elsewhere. You can take the business and the industry and the road and the school elsewhere. Now, in the news this week, that's the sound of chainsaws, cherry pickers, chippers, and in the background, the metro train as crews brought down the 305-year-old tree in North Bethesda at the intersection of Rockville Pike, Grosvenor Lane, and Beach Drive, just under the metro train bridge that passes nearby. It is estimated that the tree was seeded in 1718 and has survived through the American Revolution, several wars in Maryland outside of Washington, D.C., and finally, the building of the Washington Metro. The story behind the tree is legendary. In the 1970s, when Washington Metro was building its red line out beyond Bethesda, yet to reach Twin Brook, Rockville, and Shady Grove, the track construction was going to cut down the linden oak. But at that time, Montgomery County Council member Ida Mae Garrett picked up the cause on behalf of the tree and forced Metro to redirect its tracks by more than 100 feet. Since then, the tree has been a mild curiosity in the region and even has its own Atlas Obscura entry. Concern for the tree perked up again a few years ago. An arborist report at that time said that the decay really started with the soil movement and disturbance going back to the metro construction. Ida Mae Garrett had moved the metro, kept the tree alive for 50 years longer than it would have, but the soil disturbance finally caught up. The tree has been dead for at least a year, if not more. Walking by as the crews were taking down the tree was a local resident who had moved on from the linden oak.
I'm so glad they're taking the linden oak down because I have several, like 4 friends who giant dead trees have fallen on their house and caved in their living room or their garage or part of their house, and thank goodness did not kill a person.
Sure. But there are no houses here, so what's your concern?
But Sunil, people, this is a huge thoroughfare, and when they close this every weekend,
Right.
it's packed with people. And this is a thoroughfare as small as this one.
Montgomery Parks, which owns the land on which the linden oak sat, has hired Olney chainsaw artist Colin Vale to turn the base of the tree into a sculpture. Reason to continue to visit the spot. I'll be back with housing activist Mike English. You're listening to I Hate Politics. I am Sunil Dasgupta.
My heart's always had on a bulletproof vest, and my mind always thinks that it knows what's best. I know I look like I'm ready to fight, but baby, I love you, just hold me tight. I tell you, we can never go home. You say it's a place that follows our own, and you'll be right there.
Mike English, welcome back to I Hate Politics.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be back.
Montgomery County yesterday passed a new permanent countywide rent control law. What are the key provisions of this new bill?
The main ones are that it caps rent at CPI, Consumer Price Index, essentially inflation, plus 3%, but up to a hard cap of 6%. So that, if inflation is 2%, it would effectively be a 5% cap. If inflation's at 4%, it can't go all the way to 7%. It would still be capped at 6%. There is also a 23-year exemption for new construction from when the building is built. So long story short, a building that was built in the year 2000 at the end of this year would become subject to rent stabilization. A building built today will become subject in 23 years and everything in between. There is a 15-year exemption for significant renovation, which is defined as amounting as 40% of the fair market value of the building. So if a building's old enough that it's stabilized but undergoes this significant renovation, it gets a 15-year exemption at that point. And there is also a provision of rent banking and vacancy control that were kind of worked on together. Vacancy control is essentially the idea that rent stabilization should apply even between tenants. And most rent stabilization laws don't do that. Some do. The argument for it is, it is a more protects rents for a longer period of time, but there is some concern that if you don't have vacancy control, it can incentivize a landlord to not renew to a tenant because they can get a higher market rate when somebody else comes in. When it is not controlled, it's called vacancy decontrol, which basically means that you can raise the rent to whatever between tenants. This gets a little complicated in Maryland because some people I included in this advocate for something called just cause eviction, which basically, separate to all this, means that landlords have to offer a lease to a tenant that's already there unless they broke the lease for non-payment or other reasons, right? They have to have a compelling reason, a just cause, hence the name, not to renew. Since Maryland does not have that law, and the way the law is structured, it doesn't allow Montgomery County to have that law unless the law changes. Advocates for stricter rent control measures, it was a big part of the push of that coalition to have vacancy control. The concern with vacancy control is that it makes it stricter and can make it hard to renovate and could discourage investment and what have you, both in new buildings and in repairs. So the rent banking was kind of done to ameliorate that concern. Let's give an example. If over the previous 4 years, the landlord was allowed to raise the rent 4% each year, but only raise it 3% each year, they would have 4% increase banked. If the cap would be 5%, but they've banked 6%, they could still only go up 10%, because even though 6 would get them to 11, the rent banking caps at 10%.
Now, all of this comes into effect in 91 days.
It's 91 days, but I believe it is 91 days once the county has finalized associated recommendations with the bill.
What regulations remain at this point?
One that comes to mind is that landlords can petition for a fair return, I believe is the term that's used, on rent or on investment to, again, get a bigger increase than they otherwise be allowed. And there was some back and forth onto exactly what that should be. So the council basically said, well, we can have the language in there and that can be clarified in regulation. Another one was there's some language about putting in language so that fees can be regulated.
There is a difference between rent and fees.
If the rent is capped and you can only raise it, say, $100, but fees aren't capped, well, then there's some concern that landlords might just charge a new parking fee a new amenity fee, something like that, and have a rent increase in all but name, right? So there is language being constructed to try to address that, the exact terms of which are not yet final.
Okay. And so until those terms are finalized and the county prepares those calculations, we have to wait for this to take effect. And it's going to be 91 days after the council approves those regulations, correct?
I believe that is correct, yes. One other exemption is that none of all of what we've talked about applies to landlords who own 2 units or fewer.
There is some controversy around the term rent control and rent stabilization. What is the difference between those two?
Stabilization tends to refer to something like Montgomery County just passed. We are not going to dictate exactly what the rent should be. We're going to say whatever the baseline is, you can raise it by X amount given Y fact. And it's an automated thing that adjusts with time. Rent control, there are some places, I think New York City still has a board like this, where there's a board that literally determines what the allowable rent is on a year-by-year basis. Rent control is generally seen as stricter.
It now seems that a big part of the DC rental market, Washington, DC area rental market, is now under rent control. So DC has rent control, Prince George's has rent control, and Montgomery has rent control. They have different versions of it. Right. But there is a wide acceptance in the broader housing market in Washington, D.C. of this methodology.
Right. And that, I think that both makes it more possible, but also means that the laws have to take each other into account. And let me say how I mean that. DC's law doesn't do a 5-year, 10-year, 23-year, any year thing. The way DC's law works is, if I believe 1976 is the year, if a building was built after that, it's not rent stabilized ever. Just won't be. There's some exceptions, but by and large, it will not be. If it was built before 1976, it is stabilized. And one of the things, an amendment that was proposed that was, I think it lost by a single vote. It was a close margin, was to, instead of having, so the bill left committee with a 15-year exemption to extend it to 23. An amendment was proposed to make it so that it was a fixed year in 2000. So
you are talking about an exemption about new construction, right?
Correct. So it would basically take DC's law for new construction exemption as frozen in time, except instead of 1976, it would be, if it was built after 2000, it would never have stabilization. If it was built before 2000, it would have stabilization. The argument for that is that there are real concerns around development anytime you do stabilization, and it would mitigate those, largely eliminate them. The concern with that law is that it's like too much of an overcorrection, and that it would essentially mean that as more and more time goes on and you get further and further away from the year 2000, that you're helping fewer and fewer people. There's always a balance. Because there's a non-zero amount of impact on development, doesn't mean that the law is not worth doing. Does it do little enough impact on development that it does more good with the tenant protections than it does development harm? Some people concerned the law brings up is that now DC and Northern Virginia, because DC effectively doesn't have rent stabilization for new buildings, and Northern Virginia, just to my knowledge, doesn't have rent stabilization at all. They are now more attractive markets for development. And that's strictly speaking true, but there's a lot of variables in every market, rent stabilization being only one of them. So I think those concerns are real, and I think it will have an impact on development. I am somewhat skeptical of like the sky is falling arguments, but we'll find out, I guess.
Even a few years ago, a countywide rent control law seemed unimaginable. Right? There were some meager efforts to get it in the past, but these were quickly shut down. Why do you think these efforts succeeded this time around?
The base reason is that the housing crisis keeps getting worse, and a lot of people are rent burdened, and and this also applies to people trying to buy homes, but we're talking renters here. like a lot of people can't afford rent. And so there is more urgency on their part to do something. And that means there's more pressure on council members to do something. And rent stabilization is a relatively straightforward pitch on that. I also think that we had emergency rent stabilization measures during the pandemic. They were temporary and they were announced as temporary at the time, but it showed a precedent for that passing. And I think that emboldened activists. The expansion of the council, so we went from 9 to 11 members, and a lot of the new members that came in some redrawn districts are, a more progressive ilk and more sympathetic to rent stabilization. And rent control or stabilization, I'd say advocates were not unaware of the fact that they now had people on the council going to be willing to sponsor this. Council members Macon Jawando were the big pushers of the Home Act. There's also been more done at the regional level, like Prince George's County has a law. It's temporary. It was put in place temporarily, very much under the auspices of we're doing this while we're working on a permanent one. There was a lot of organization and a lot of in-depth advocacy around it. And that was a huge part of it.
Let's talk about the other side. Who are the people that oppose the bill?
Broadly speaking, developers, landlords, large apartment owners, and groups that represent them, ones that they did stand a lot to lose in this, quote unquote, right? Perceived or real. And I think it's a mix. And that was a lot of the opposition.
There was also in the council, in the debate, some consideration of a sunset clause that would make this law a temporary law.
It was originally proposed, and it came from Councilmember Albornoz. It was originally proposed as 3 years, and he amended the amendment to be 5 years. But yeah, it would basically say after 5 years, that the law would sunset, become no longer the law, unless it was proactively passed again.
Why do YIMBYs think rent control is bad?
To the degree that a YIMBY will say rent control is bad, it would basically be the economics 101. Because rent stabilization makes return on investment lower, it will thus lower investment, thus creating less housing. Because of those disincentives, it'll hurt supply enough that it actually raises prices in the long run. And that criticism is not wrong. It's just, to me, it very much depends on how the bill is structured. There will probably be some developments that don't go forward because the developer is skittish about the new law and pulls out. But we don't live in a world where, absent rent stabilization, we'd have all the housing we need. We know that because Montgomery County it's tens of thousands of units short of its housing goals, and we didn't have rent stabilization all that time. There is also a benefit to people having a predictable place to live. I mean, you can even go down to there is value to, for example, school children not have to change schools all the time because their families are being priced out and, having to move constantly.
Seems like you did find yourself in the middle of this debate between YIMBYs who want to increase supply, most of all, and those that are rent control advocates, who want to provide relief for renters right now. Seems like, I think it's like economics versus politics to me, right?
I think that's broadly true to the entire nature and point of this podcast. That's what politics is. We don't live in an economics textbook, right? And believe me, people have said some very mean things about me because I say that supply and demand applies to housing, right? I 100% does. And I actually think that that's a bigger part of the solution than rent stabilization is, to be frank. But both play a big role on it. And neither one is going to do it alone. And
they are in contradiction with each other, which is to say that if you do rent control, you are in fact disincentivizing future investment in housing. Now, you said it is a non-zero number. We don't know how much that number is.
But again, the magnitude matters. In order to get all of the housing that we need to have supply, not alone, but for the most part, just within say 10 years, we would need to change all zoning laws so that triplexes and quadplexes are allowed in most of the county, which I think would be a good thing to do, right? We need to do larger upzoning anywhere near transit. We would need to eliminate parking minimums. We need to eliminate setback requirements. We need to do all these things that just realistically speaking, are not going to happen. The idea that absent rent stabilization, there's any realistic path to private development or public development for that matter, development as a whole, giving us the housing we need, that's not happening in the next 10, 20 years anyway. We should work on it and we should make it better. But like, that's not happening. There's so many other obstacles in the way. So I don't want to use it as an excuse.
You know, a few years ago, I thought that the solution to all of this lay in a grand bargain where you got permanent countywide rent stabilization control of some sort. And then on the other side, you got a complete upzoning of the county to allow at least for triplexes and quadplexes. But, you know, the rent control law and the debate around it has not touched the zoning issue at all in my understanding.
There's some history for trying to tie these together. The previous council with Councilmember Jawanda was also on. He did propose together. Now, it wasn't uniform. Both were, I believe, targeted around metro stations, and they were very different proposals. But he did target a ZTA that would have done fairly broad upzoning, like I think up to quadplexes, along with a rent stabilization bill that looked very different than this one. So there is some precedent that being part of the narrative. To your point, and what I think you mean here is like this current push of these two bills, yeah, like there was not an upzoning conversation that happened along with that.
There is also the argument that because we are building in a lag period, right? First, the way in which the regs are going to be written, the regulations are going to be written, and then the 91-day period, that renters are going to see some steep increases in this period where landlords reset their benchmarks.
So I believe it was Councilmember Mink that wanted to shorten it from, I think it was like 9 months previously to the 90 days, or it might have been 6 months before. That was the motivation to make it a shorter period, to limit the ability for landlords to do that. And yeah, again, it's impossible to craft a bill that has no negative impact. That is a real risk. I would say it's somewhat limited by, you know, when leases come up and do they have an incentive to do it more than usual? Absolutely. Competition still matters to some degree, right? Obviously only helps so much. I don't know that I think it's going to be as widespread as some people fear, but I think it will probably happen to some degree. Yeah.
Now, the new county law does not apply inside the city of Gaithersburg or Rockville, right?
Correct. Not to Gaithersburg, not to Rockville, where you may be going with this, most of District 3, which is where a key vote came from.
That's right. I mean, and Sidney Katz, you know, is from District 3, which, you know, includes Gaithersburg and Rockville. It doesn't apply there that much. And the Gaithersburg Council was opposed to it. Sidney Katz is, very close to the Gaithersburg Council folks. So it seems like a really interesting vote from him.
Interesting's a good word for it. It's, again, I don't know anyone's head or heart but my own, right? But I mean, you do have a situation where we talked about, and I wouldn't say Sidney Katz is a YIMBY, but he is someone who does want investment to happen in his district. It's a concern he has, right? And I was talking earlier about how I think there's still some, but I think there's much less hostility to stabilization measures from many people who are concerned with needing more development, including myself, right? So it's not as hard a line as it used to be. He may have been swayed by the case. There was a lot of lobbying, a lot of organizing around this. There were, some arguments made better than others, but real compelling arguments were made. He may have been swayed. And then another thing keep in mind with all this is he can't run again. He's term limited. So to some degree, yes, Gaithersburg is mad at him, but what are they going to do about it? Not to be crass about this.
Let's talk a little bit about the groups that organized to push this through.
CASA was a big one, which is a immigrant rights organization, and I think correctly identifies housing and tenant protection issues as relevant to that population, right? The MORE network broadly, the Montgomery County Racial Equity Network, which I believe CASA is part of. Jews United for Justice is a part of that, JUFJ, which I'm a member of, again, speaking my only capacity. AIM, Action Montgomery signed on. There were 4 the organizations that DSA, which I'm not a member of, but the Democratic Socialist America Montgomery County chapter backed this. There were a lot, right? And I'll use the term the Home Act Coalition, but like there were groups that supported that stricter bill. And a lot of that advocacy carried over to making sure that when these were amended, that, you know, the bill turned out in a relatively as tenant friendly as it could be, right? And that was a very active coalition on this for like a year and a half. Like, I mean, longer than that, but specifically on these bills, they turned out a lot of people and put consistent pressure, and that had an impact.
What about, you know, the growing Latino population? And in particular, I'm thinking about Natalie Fanny Gonzalez's evolution on this. I mean, she has been supportive of rent control, I think, during her campaign, but also she was the one that proposed the anti-gouging bill in its early form, right? So there were two bills. One was the Home Act bill, which was supported by Joan Doe and Kristen Mink, and it was more strict. And then there was the anti-gouging bill, which was less strict, more, let's say, developer friendly. But over this debate, Natalie Fanny Gonzalez and that bill changed to become the one that passed. And so does the presence of a large Latino population, the creation of a new district, D6, that has that contains much of that population, do you think that had an impact on how things shaped up?
That population is protected in a large degree by rent stabilization, and that's probably a factor. I think a lot of it is similar than that, in that Councilmember Gonzalez is, she is pro-development. She was on the planning board before. I agreed, as a YIMBY, agreed with most of the things she did on the planning board, and then most of the things she said in her race and whatnot. But she also is she has a progressive background. Like, I think she's someone who believes in rent stabilization. So, like, I don't think it was entirely driven by that district, but I do think that it was very much seen, and to your point, like, some of these organizations had roles in the campaigns and whatnot. Like, I am sure she got the signal that this was a priority for many in her community, and I'm sure that played a role. I was not surprised that Councilmember Fanny Gonzalez shifted at all, like, in committee. I was quite surprised by how much she did, to your point, right? Like, I did not, I would have predicted a different outcome.
In the podcast, right after the July 2022 primary, I did a straw poll on rent control. And I said that Natalie Fanny Gonzalez is going to be a supporter. But I got that right, but I got Sidney Katz wrong completely, because I thought that he was going to oppose it, and he ended up supporting it. So, I
mean, I would have made the same prediction. Like, I can't lecture you here. I think Sidney Katz surprised a lot of people.
Developers in Montgomery County and in local politics, more generally, are considered to be the most powerful actors, right? Money is politics, is what we say about that. But just in 2023, developers have taken a series of hits. Increase in property taxes, increase in recordation taxes, increase in impact taxes, and now rent control. What does this tell you about the so-called developer lobby, the power of developers in local politics?
I think it tells you that it's overblown. Now, that's not to say it's real. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that developers, and they give campaign contributions, and like they have meaningful input and sway in similar ways. Like, any organization that spends a lot of time advocating and lobbying for the council is going to have some sway. They do some of that with campaign dollars, and that's an impact. Developers are far too readily demonized as sort of an easy throwaway villain in progressive movements. They're humans. They're not sinners. They're not saints. Some of them are jerks. Some of them are nice. They are self-interested in making a profit, and they will do things like oppose this legislation in order to do that. So like, I don't think anyone should trust them or take them at their word or anything. But I think the idea that there's this hyper competent force that's down there ready to make the council bend to its whim was never true, and I think this displays that.
But do you think there will be an exodus of developers from Montgomery County as a consequence of the rent control bill?
I do not see a long-term mass exodus happening. I do think there is reason to believe that, there was a letter that came out that a developer said, me and these 5 others, right? I don't remember any of their names, are going to leave, and they said projects will be canceled. And I've heard some specific ones, and I suspect some in the short term will be. I do not think the bill is so strict that it's going to permanently, dramatically lower the amount of development. Otherwise, I would not have supported it. But we are all guessing. In the short term, vibes matter, feelings matter, sentiment matters. You mentioned the recordation tax increase, the property tax increase, the stabilization thing, and I supported all those other ones as well. I think individually they're good. They do collectively send a signal, and that signal is not, hey, come in here and invest, right? So I think it's very important. We very much need to start sending signals that we are welcome to investment with its, whether it's with incentives, whether it's with zoning changes, whether it's parking minimum change, all these things. And I think that those signals matter. So I think developers have gotten enough of a signal that some of them are going to, over the next year, take the ball and go home. I don't know that I think it's going to be a lot of them over the long term. And I think that to the degree any would exit now, it could be political signaling. It could be, frankly, uncertainty. And that as the law progresses over the next few years, I'm optimistic that'll all move.
Why are you optimistic? What is the reason for your optimism?
So, there have been studies are kind of all over the place, right? You can find a study say whatever. There is a fair bit of research. Now, this is on a statewide level in California, and we are a tighter region with competitors closer than the state of California has. So I'm hesitant to say it's 1-to-1 and that everyone should feel fine about everything. There is some suggestion that, I think they had a different law. I think it was CPI plus 5% and a 15-year exemption, something like that. And they did not see a tremendous loss. They studied certain cities in California. Oregon has a similar law, whatever. There have been cases where some stabilization has passed and you have not seen a cratering in development. You saw that. You've seen the opposite. St. Paul had a very strict law and they amended it because development cratered that much, right? So but let's put it this way. Some research has indicated that if a grace period is long enough, and we have a quite long one, and there's other protections, development can and will continue. Even in those cases, I suspect there's been some decrease in it, right? But I think that, because the exemption gives enough time for developers largely pay back their loans and stuff like that, that's why I'm optimistic. But I want to be very clear here. Like everyone else, I'm guessing here. I could be wrong. And if I'm wrong, I will have to reflect on that. A lot has just happened. There have been a lot of signals sent in the last 6 months. That's going to have some impact. I do think that, there will still be some developers that stick around. There might be others that come in. It's going to take, for better or worse, a year or two for the realities of what this policy does and doesn't do to kick in. And I would be skeptical of overreading any signals, positive or negative, whether it shows that everything's fine or that everything's terrible. I would wait a little bit to begin. So one thing I do want to mention is there's a Harvard their housing center puts out a report each year on the state of housing. And that report has already flagged that nationwide, they expect sort of a downturn in the amount of multifamily building. So you could see us build less, and some of it could be to other factors as well. I think some of it might be to the law, right? But I'm optimistic.
Mike English, thanks for explaining the rent control law.
Thank you for having me.
You're listening to I Hate Politics. I am Sunil Dasgupta. What lessons should we draw from my conversation with housing activist Mike English, who found himself in the middle of a debate on rent control and its effects on housing affordability in Montgomery County? First, it is hard not to recognize that changes in politics built a coalition that has pushed through rent control in two suburban Washington, D.C. counties, Prince George's and Montgomery. Mike English is right. Washington, D.C.'s own rent control law is weak, holding in rent control only buildings that are now 50 years old. Arguably, the law may have contributed to faster development as building owners saw an interest in demolishing old buildings for new ones, if only to get out of rent control. Still, three major regional jurisdictions with some form of rent control is a political signal. By any measure, the legislative bodies of all three jurisdictions are far more progressive today than they were in the past. The change in the compositions of the councils has opened a path for progressive organizations such as CASA, the Immigrant Rights Group, and Jews United for Justice to press their claims strongly. The creation of a Latino Plurality County Council seat, District 6, in Montgomery County, not only helped elect Natalie Gonzalez to the council, but also ties the council members' future to meeting the demands of this population. County Executive Mark Elrich has said that he has been fighting for rent control for 35 years. That's been a 4-decade constant. What changed is politics in the new council, backed by new districts. Second, the economics of rent control have always been iffy. Builders build because they can make money. The more they can make within the constraints of the market, the better. Constraining rents lowers profits and discourages investments, which doesn't mean that there will be no new construction, but rather that the marginal new project will not be built. The choke point really is financing. Builders don't hold all the cash they need for a new project, and they have to raise money, sometimes from pension funds we ourselves own. Fund managers have a fiduciary responsibility to us to get the maximum gains on our money by funding the most lucrative deals. Economics also implies game theory. Developers build and then they will sell the building somewhere between 7 and 15 years. If the applicability of the rent law starts in 10, 15, or 23 years, the future expectation of constrained rent will reduce the expected sale price no matter how much in the future it is. This could very well mean that initial rents in the early years of a building will be higher to make up for that final discount in the sale price. That's a long-term game. The short-term game also has downsides. It is several months before the new law goes into effect. Expect landlords to raise rents steeply before the onset of the law, subject only to what the market will bear. Third, when you put economics and politics together, what do you get? When the two are in conflict, politics tends to win immediate battles. Those who swear by economics argue that in the long run, their argument will prevail. And in many cases, they are correct. But as economist John Maynard Keynes wrote, the long run is a misleading guide to current affairs. In the long run, we are all dead. Keynes might as well have been a political scientist. For better and for worse, we ignore politics at our own peril. That's all for this episode. You're listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. Music for this episode comes from the band Finster. Kate Servino Johnson on vocals and guitar, Doogie Whitaker on guitar and vocals, Howard Rayback on bass, and Matt Zelenz on the drums. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email us at producer@ihppod.org. I hope you'll subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.
I like the fact that when you sleep, you snore up a storm, you tangle the sheets. I like the fact that when you wake, you're ready to move, you're ready to shake. When we fight, it lasts through the day and into the night. I like the fact that when we make up, we do it all night till the sun comes up. I like the fact, 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 I like